The great hall of the Zorvani Empire fell silent as high. Empress Valeth rose from her throne and looked upon the gathered council members with her 4 silver eyes that seemed to pierce through every soul in the room. She had ruled this empire for over 300 years and had seen it rise to greatness across 1,000 star systems. But now she watched it slowly dying from within. The Zorvani were a proud species with iridescent skin that shimmered like opals in the light of their twin suns. And they possessed 4 arms that moved with grace that other species found mesmerizing, but their pride could not save them from the truth that their birth rates had fallen to dangerous levels and their genetic diversity had crumbled to almost nothing. Every scientist in the empire had tried to solve this problem, and every attempt had failed miserably. Artificial reproduction created weak offspring that rarely survived past childhood, and genetic modifications only made things worse by introducing new diseases and deformities. Valeth had spent decades searching for a solution, sending her best researchers to every corner of the galaxy. And finally they had found something unexpected on a small blue planet that most civilizations considered primitive and unimportant. The planet was called Earth, and its dominant species were known as humans. When Valeth announced her decree to the council, the reaction was immediate and violent. She declared that she would bring a human male to their homeworld to serve as a genetic donor for her 3 daughters, the princesses who would one day inherit the throne and continue. The Imperial Bloodline Council members shouted in outrage, and several of them stood up from their seats with their 4 arms waving in the air. Grand Admiral Dexter, a decorated war hero with scars across his face from 100 battles, slammed his fist against the table and demanded to know if the Empress had lost her mind. He called humans nothing more than animals who had barely discovered space travel, and said that mixing their sacred bloodline with such creatures was an abomination against everything the Zorvani had. Valeth raised one hand, and the room fell silent again, because no one dared to speak when the Empress demanded quiet. She explained what her scientists had discovered. After years of research on hundreds of different species across the galaxy, human DNA possessed something remarkable that no other species had, something that the researchers called adaptive compatibility, where other species had rigid genetic structures that resisted change and rejected foreign material. Human genes were like water that flowed and adapted to fill whatever container held them. They could bond with almost any compatible life form and produce healthy offspring, something that should have been impossible according to everything the Zorvani understood about biology. More importantly, the scientists had found that human genetic material contained the exact proteins and sequences needed to revitalize Zorvani reproduction. It was as if nature had designed humans specifically to be the missing piece of the puzzle that the Zorvani had been trying to solve for centuries. The council argued for hours, but Valeth had already made her decision, and the Empress's word was law. She gave strict instructions to the ship she dispatched to Earth: find a suitable human male who was healthy and intelligent, but most importantly, find one who was willing to come. She would not take anyone by force, because this had to be a choice made freely, and she understood that cooperation would yield better results than coercion on the planet Earth. In the middle of a vast desert in a place called Nevada, a man named Danny Cole was having what he considered the worst day of his entire life. His small cargo shipping company had gone bankrupt after his business partner disappeared with most of their money. His apartment lease had expired 3 days ago, and he was currently homeless with nothing but an old truck that had just broken down on Lee's highway with no other vehicles in sight. Danny was 32 years old with brown hair that was always messy, no matter how much he tried to comb it, and he had the kind of face that people described as friendly but forgettable. He had served in the Marines for 6 years before starting his business. And now all of that hard work had turned to dust. He sat on the hood of his dead truck and stared at the endless desert stretching in every direction, wondering how his life had gone so wrong so quickly. His ex-girlfriend had emptied their joint savings account and left him a note that simply said she had found someone better. And Danny could not even argue with her because he had started to believe she was right. He was a nobody going nowhere. And the universe seemed determined to remind him of that fact every single day when the massive alien vessel descended from the clouds and landed on the highway about 50 feet from his truck. Danny did not scream or run away. He just sat there and watched with a strange sense of calm, thinking that whatever happened next could not possibly be worse than what he was already going through. The ship was enormous and shaped like a teardrop, made of some kind of dark metal that absorbed the sunlight instead of reflecting it. And when a door opened in its side, Danny saw several tall figures emerge and walk toward him. They were unlike anything he had ever seen, with skin that shimmered with colors that shifted as they moved and 4 arms that bent in ways that human arms could not. The one in front wore what looked like a military uniform and carried a small device that it held up toward Danny when the alien spoke. The words that came out of the device were in English, though the voice sounded strange and artificial. The alien introduced itself as Commander Sirith and said it had come to make Danny an offer that would change his life. Forever Danny listened as Sirith explained everything. The dying Zervani Empire, the genetic compatibility of humans, the Empress's decree, and the role that Danny could play in saving an entire civilization in return for his cooperation. Danny would receive wealth beyond anything Earth could offer, comfortable living quarters in an imperial palace, and most importantly, a purpose that actually mattered. Danny asked if he would be treated with respect or if he would be nothing more than a prisoner or a piece of livestock to be used and discarded. Scythe assured him that he would be honored as a guest, and that the Empress herself had forbidden any mistreatment of the human who agreed to help them. Danny looked at his broken truck, then at the empty desert, and then at the massive alien ship waiting on the highway. He thought about his empty wallet and his empty apartment and his empty life. And he started to laugh because the absurdity of the situation was too much to process any other way. He told Sarath that he had absolutely nothing left to lose and asked when they were leaving. Zareth seemed confused by the laughter, but led Danny to the ship without further questions. As the vessel rose into the sky and Earth grew smaller beneath them, Danny watched his home planet disappear and felt something he had not felt in years. He felt hope, strange and unexpected, like a small flame flickering to life in the darkness that had surrounded him for so long. He had no idea what awaited him on Zorth Prime, but for the first time in his life, he was genuinely curious to find out. The journey through the stars took 3 weeks, and during that time, Danny Cole experienced wonders that he could never have imagined back on Earth. His quarters aboard the Zorvani vessel were larger than any apartment he had ever rented, with a bed that seemed to adjust itself perfectly to his body and walls that could display any scene requested, from mountains to oceans to forests filled with strange alien trees. The food they served him was unusual in appearance, with colors and textures that looked nothing like anything from Earth. But the taste was surprisingly delicious and left him feeling satisfied in ways that human meals rarely did. Commander Sereth assigned a young Zorvani officer named Tethys to teach Danny their language and customs so that he would not embarrass himself when he arrived at the Imperial Palace. Tethys was patient and kind, explaining that the Zorvani had a complex society built on honor and hierarchy, where every gesture and word carried meaning that could take years to fully understand. Danny learned that their species did not reproduce the way humans did, and the process was far more complicated than anything he had expected. The Zorvani bonding ritual required compatibility on 3 different levels that they called physical, chemical, and resonance. Physical compatibility meant that the genetic material could actually combine without rejection. Chemical compatibility meant that the biological processes would function correctly. And resonance was something harder to explain. This described resonance as a kind of spiritual connection, a harmony between the souls of those contributing to the creation of new life. Danny was not sure he believed in souls, but he kept that thought to himself and simply nodded as if he understood perfectly when the ship finally arrived at Zorth Prime. Danny stood at a viewing window and watched as the planet grew larger before him. It was beautiful in a way that took his breath away, with swirling purple clouds and vast oceans that glowed with bioluminescent life, visible even from orbit. The capital city was a sprawling metropolis of crystalline spires that caught the light of the twin suns and scattered it into rainbows across the landscape as the ship descended toward the Imperial Palace. Danny saw thousands of Zorvani lining the streets below, all of them staring up at the vessel that carried the human who might save their species. Some of their faces showed curiosity while others showed disgust. And Danny tried not to think too hard about how strange it was to be the center of so much attention. The palace itself was the tallest structure in the city, rising so high that its upper levels disappeared into the clouds. Guards in ceremonial armor stood at every entrance, their 4 arms holding weapons that Danny could not identify but assumed were extremely deadly. Commander Cirith led Danny through a maze of corridors lined with artwork and tapestries that depicted the history of the Zorvani Empire, showing great battles and wise rulers and moments of triumph that spanned thousands of years. The throne room was enormous, with ceilings so high that Danny could barely see the intricate patterns painted across them. At the far end sat High Empress Valith on a throne carved from a single piece of crystal that pulsed with soft inner light. She rose as Danny approached and walked down the steps to meet him, which Tethys later explained was an extraordinary honor that the Empress rarely bestowed upon Eniona. Valith thanked Danny for agreeing to help her people and promised that his contribution would be remembered for generations to come. Her voice was deep and resonant, carrying a weight of authority that made Danny want to stand up straighter and pay attention to every word. Then she introduced her 3 daughters, and Danny realized that his situation was about to become much more complicated. Princess Kelith was the eldest, a warrior who had commanded armies in battles along the Empire's borders. She was tall even by Zorvani standards, with scars on 2 of her arms that she displayed proudly as marks of her service. When she looked at Danny, her expression was cold and dismissive, as if she were examining an insect that had crawled into her home uninvited. Princess Myrith was the middle daughter, a scientist who had dedicated her life to studying genetics and biology in hopes of finding a solution to their species. Decline. She approached Danny with clinical fascination, circling him and asking questions about human physiology that made him deeply uncomfortable. She wanted to know about his diet and his exercise habits and his family medical history, and she seemed disappointed when he could not provide detailed answers to her more technical inquiries. Princess Lythe was the youngest, barely past adulthood by Zorvani standards, with a gentleness in her silver eyes that set her apart from her sisters. She offered Danny a small smile and welcomed him to their home in a voice so soft that he had to lean in to hear her properly. That smile was the first genuine warmth Danny had felt since arriving on this alien world, and he found himself grateful for it in ways he could not fully explain. The compatibility testing began the very next morning and continued for days without rest. Zorvani scientists subjected Danny to every scan and examination their technology could provide, mapping his entire genetic code and analyzing every aspect of his biochemistry. They measured his resonance potential using devices that hummed with energy and projected strange patterns of light around his body. Danny cooperated with everything they asked, though he understood almost nothing about what they were actually doing. When the results finally came back, the scientists could not contain their excitement. Danny's compatibility rating was higher than any subject they had ever tested, including members of their own species from the healthiest genetic lines. There was something in his DNA, some quirk of human evolution that they could not fully explain, that made him almost perfectly suited for Zovani genetic bonding. High Empress Veleth received the news with a rare smile that transformed her stern face into something almost warm. She looked at Danny with new appreciation and said that perhaps humans were not as primitive as the galaxy believed them to. But Danny was not sure how to respond to that, so he simply nodded and tried to ignore the way Princess Calith was glaring at him from across the room. He had a feeling that his time on Zorith Prime was going to be far more challenging than anyone had warned him about. The news of Danny's exceptional compatibility spread through the Empire like fire through dry grass, and not everyone was pleased by what they heard. Grand Admiral Dexter had opposed the Empress's decree from the very beginning, but now his opposition transformed into something far more dangerous. He gathered supporters from among the noble houses and military commanders who shared his beliefs, and together they formed a movement that called itself the Purists. Their message was simple and appealing to those who feared change. The Zorvani were a superior species who should accept extinction with dignity rather than corrupt their sacred bloodline with alien contamination. Thacker gave speeches in the outer colonies where the Empress's influence was weakest, speaking of racial purity and ancestral honor and the shame that future generations would feel if they allowed this abomination to continue. His words found eager listeners among those who had always looked down on other species and could not accept the idea that a human might hold the key to their survival. Danny first became aware of the danger when he returned to his quarters one evening and found a message carved deep into his door. Translation provided by his personal device read simply, "Leave or die." Animal, he stared at those words for a long time, feeling a cold knot form in his stomach as he realized that not everyone on this world wanted him to succeed. Princess Calith arrived within the hour, summoned by the guards who had discovered the threat. Despite her personal feelings about the arrangement, she understood that her duty to the Empire required her to protect this human who had become essential to their future. She assigned a squad of her finest soldiers to guard Danny at all times, warriors who had served under her command in actual combat and would give their lives without hesitation. She also began spending time with Danny herself, initially claiming that she needed to assess whether he was worth all the trouble he was causing. What she discovered during those conversations surprised her more than she cared to admit. Danny was not the crude and simple barbarian she had expected him to be. He was thoughtful and observant, with a self-deprecating sense of humor that she had never encountered in anyone from her own species. When she asked about his accomplishments on Earth, expecting to hear boastful stories, he simply shrugged and said he had been a nobody doing nothing important. He had no ambition for power and no desire for glory. And he seemed genuinely confused when Calith asked what he hoped to gain from helping the Zorvani. He told her that he had come because he had nothing better to do and figured he might as well help if he could. Calith found this incomprehensible because in Zorvani society, status was everything, and wars had been fought over minor insults to noble houses. Yet this human shrugged off threats against his life and asked if there was anything useful he could do while waiting for the genetic procedures to begin. High Empress Veleth assigned Danny to work with Princess Myrith in her laboratory, thinking that the arrangement might help both of them. Danny had no scientific training whatsoever, but he proved surprisingly helpful in ways that no one had anticipated. His perspective as an outsider allowed him to ask questions that Zervani scientists had never thought to consider because their assumptions had become invisible to them. Why did they always perform certain processes in a particular sequence when there was no obvious reason for that order? Had they ever tried simpler approaches instead of adding more complexity to their already complicated procedures? What if the problem was not that they needed more advanced technology, but that their existing technology was too rigid to work properly? Limerith initially dismissed these questions as the ignorant ramblings of someone who did not understand what he was talking about. But at one of Danny's casual suggestions about letting genetic material adapt naturally instead of forcing it through technological intervention led to a breakthrough that changed everything. The results of the new approach were remarkable, producing healthy genetic combinations at rates far higher than anything they had achieved before. Mirith looked at Danny with new respect and admitted that sometimes the most obvious questions were the ones that experts forgot to ask. Meanwhile, Princess Lythe found herself drawn to the human in ways that confused and frightened her. She visited his quarters often, bringing him books about Zervani history and art, and in return she asked him endless questions about Earth. Danny told her about oceans so vast that you could sail for weeks without seeing land, and forests so dense that sunlight never reached the ground. He described cities where millions of people lived, stacked on top of each other in buildings that scraped against the sky, and small towns where everyone knew their neighbors by name. He shared stories of human music that could make people weep with joy or sorrow, and art that captured moments of beauty so perfectly that they seemed to stop time itself. Lythe had never met anyone who spoke so openly about the flaws of his own species. The Zervani were taught from birth that they were superior to all other races in the galaxy, but Danny admitted freely that humans had nearly destroyed their own planet through greed and short-sightedness. Told her about wars fought over trivial differences and cruelties inflicted for no reason other than fear and hatred. Yet he also spoke of incredible kindness, of strangers risking their lives to save others, and communities coming together in times of disaster to support those in need. Humans were capable of being selfish and petty and cruel, but they were also capable of love so fierce that it could change the world. It was this capacity for love that had brought Danny to Zarth Prime. He explained to Lythe during one of their long conversations. He had no delusions about being special or important, but he believed that even someone as ordinary as himself could do something that mattered if he was willing to try. Hope was what kept humans going when everything seemed impossible. And Danny had discovered that hope was surprisingly portable and had traveled with him across the stars to a world where he knew no one and understood nothing. And it burned inside him still, waiting to see what might grow from it. 6 months passed after Danny's recovery, before the genetic bonding procedures were finally completed, and during that time he had become a fixture in the Imperial Palace that no one questioned anymore. The procedures themselves were strange and uncomfortable, involving chambers filled with glowing fluid and devices that hummed with energy he could not understand. Danny simply followed the instructions he was given and trusted that the scientists knew what they were doing. When the results came back showing that all 3 princesses had successfully conceived, the celebration that erupted throughout the Empire was unlike anything Danny had ever witnessed. Fireworks exploded over every major city, and crowds gathered in the streets to sing songs of thanks and hope. The children that grew within the princesses carried a unique hybrid genetic code that combined the best traits of both species in ways that the scientists had only dreamed of achieving. When the births finally came, the medical teams were astonished by what they saw. The offspring were stronger and healthier than any Zervani children born in the past century, with immune systems that functioned perfectly and growth rates that exceeded all expectations. They were also different in ways that went beyond mere physical health. The children displayed curiosity and adaptability that pure Zolvani rarely showed, exploring their environment with an eagerness that delighted their mothers and concerned the more traditional members of the court. High Empress Valith declared Danny a full citizen of the Zorvani Empire, the first human in history to receive such an honor. He was given lands on one of the most beautiful continents on the planet, along with titles that would have made him one of the wealthiest people on Earth if such things had any meaning across interstellar distances. But the wealth and status meant nothing compared to what Danny valued most about his new life. For the first time since he could remember, he had a family. Princess Calith, who had once looked at him with contempt, became his closest friend and most trusted confidant. She visited his estate regularly to share meals and discuss everything from politics to philosophy. She told him that he was the only person in the entire empire who treated her as a person rather than a princess. And that gift was more valuable than any treasure when she faced difficult decisions about military matters or court intrigue. She sought his advice, not because he was wise, but because he was honest in ways that no one else dared to be. Princess Myrith continued her research with Danny, serving as her permanent consultant and occasional test of subject. Together, they revolutionized Zorvani genetic science, opening pathways to species revival that had seemed completely impossible before his arrivals. She published papers that credited Danny as a co-author, which caused scandal among traditionalists who could not accept a human being listed alongside Zorvani scientists, but the results spoke for themselves. And soon other researchers were begging for the opportunity to work with the remarkable human who asked questions that no one else thought to ask. Myrith told Danny that he had saved their species, not through his genes alone, but through his mind. And she considered him the most important scientific partner she had ever had. Princess Lythe had fallen in love with Danny somewhere along the way, though neither of them had spoken of it directly for many months. Zorvani customs around courtship were complex and formal, involving ritual exchanges of gifts and declarations that had to be witnessed by the proper authorities. Danny was painfully aware of the cultural differences between them and feared that pursuing anything romantic would be seen as overstepping his position. But Lythe was patient in ways that her human beloved was only beginning to understand, and watched him recover from wounds that should have killed him and seen him get up every morning determined to face whatever challenges awaited. She knew that humans experience time differently than Zorvani, their lives burning bright and brief, like stars that flared and faded within a single Zorvani lifetime. That knowledge made every moment with Danny precious beyond measure, and she refused to waste any of them on unnecessary hesitation. One evening, as they watched the twin suns set over the crystal spires of the distant capital, painting the sky in shades of purple and gold that existed nowhere else in the galaxy, Lythe finally asked Danny the question she had been holding inside for so long. She asked if he missed Earth and if he ever regretted leaving everything he knew behind to come to this strange world where he would always be different. Danny thought about the question seriously because Lythe deserved a serious answer. He remembered the desert highway where his life had changed forever, and the broken truck that had stranded him in the middle of nowhere. He thought about the empty apartment and the failed business and the loneliness that had been his constant companion for so many years. Then he looked at the alien sky stretching endlessly above them, and the woman beside him with her shimmering skin and 4 gentle hands. He thought about the children in the palace who carried part of him within their genetic code, and the friends he had made among people who were nothing like him. He told Lythe that he did not miss Earth because Earth had never felt like home. Home was supposed to be a place where you belonged and where people cared whether you lived or died. Home was supposed to be a place where your existence mattered to someone other than yourself. By that definition, he said, Zorath Prime was the first real home he had ever known. Lythe smiled with tears glistening in her silver eyes and asked him what he wanted to build now that he had found his home. Danny laughed softly and said that he had already built Ida, family and a future and a reason to keep going when things got hard. Those were the things that mattered. Not titles or wealth or the judgment of people who would never understand. The Zovani Empire entered a new era that day. One built not on conquest or claims of superiority, but on adaptation and hope, and the willingness to accept help from unexpected. Sources' history would remember High Empress Valith as the leader who made the difficult choice that saved her people from extinction, but those who knew the true story understood that the real hero was a cargo pilot from Earth named Danny Colhe. Had come to them with nothing but the clothes on his back and a willingness to help. And in return, he had given them everything they needed to survive. Sometimes the galaxy worked in mysterious ways, bringing together species separated by vast distances and profound differences, and sometimes a nobody from a primitive planet could become the most important person in an entire empire. Simply by deciding that he might as well help if he could. Danny never claimed to be special or destined for greatness. He was just a man who had been given a chance to matter, and he had taken it with both hands and never looked back. That, more than anything else, was what it meant to be human. Grand Admiral Vexer had grown tired of speeches and political maneuvering that seemed to accomplish nothing. The human was still alive, and the genetic program was progressing faster than anyone had expected, which meant that soon there would be hybrid offspring carrying both Zovani and human genes. Once those children were born, there would be no going back, and the purity of their species would be corrupted. Far of Earth, Exer decided that the only way to stop this abomination was to eliminate the source of the contamination directly. He assembled a team of assassins from among his most loyal followers, warriors who believed so strongly in the purest cause that they were willing to die for it. These were not ordinary soldiers, but specialists, trained in infiltration and silent killing, each one capable of taking down a dozen opponents before anyone could raise an alarm. The attack came during a ceremonial dinner held to celebrate the progress of the genetic research. Danny sat at the imperial table as an honored guest, surrounded by nobles and officials who still looked at him with varying degrees of discomfort. High Empress Valith presided over the gathering while her 3 daughters sat nearby, each of them having developed their own complicated feelings about the human who had entered their lives. The assassins struck without warning when the power to the entire palace suddenly failed and plunged the great hall into complete darkness. They moved through the blackness with thermal blades that glowed red-hot and could cut through armor like paper. 6 guards died in the first seconds of the attack, their throats cut before they could even reach for their weapon. Screams erupted throughout the hall as nobles scrambled to escape and soldiers tried to form defensive positions without being able to see anything. Danny reacted on pure instinct that had been drilled into him during his years in the Marines. He did not think about what he was doing or calculate the odds of survival because there was no time for such considerations. He simply moved, grabbing Princess Lithe and pulling her to the ground as a thermal blade whistled through the air where her head had been a moment earlier. The assassin's weapon sliced across Danny's back instead of finding its intended target, and the pain was unlike anything he had ever experienced. It felt like liquid fire had been poured along his spine, burning through skin and muscle with terrifying efficiencies. But Danny had learned long ago the pain could be ignored when survival was at stake, and he forced himself to keep moving despite the agony. He grabbed a ceremonial blade from a fallen guard, a weapon that was mostly decorative but still sharp enough to kill. Other princesses had escaped through a side door with their guards, but more assassins were converging on Danny's position, stood over Princess Lithe and faced the attackers with nothing but the unfamiliar weapon in his hand and the determination to protect someone who had shown him kindness. The assassins were faster and better trained than any opponent Danny had ever faced, they moved with fluid grace that seemed almost supernatural. Their forearms wielding weapons with deadly precision. Danny should have died in the first exchange of blows. But something inside him refused to surrender. He fought with desperate fury, blocking strikes that should have been impossible to see and counterattacking with moves that surprised even himself. Two assassins fell before the third. One finally got past his guard and drove a blade deep into his side. Danny collapsed to the floor with blood pooling around him as the remaining assassin raised his weapon for the killing blow. Princess Keleth burst into the hall at that moment with a squad of her elite soldiers who had restored partial power to the palace. She cut down the assassin before he could finish Danny and then ordered her troops to secure the room when she found Danny lying in his own blood, surrounded by the bodies of the enemies he had killed. Her opinion of humans changed forever. Surviving assassins were captured and brought before High Empress Valith for interrogation. They resisted at first, but Zervani interrogation techniques were thorough, and eventually they revealed everything. Grand Admiral Dexter had planned the entire attack and had promised them honors in the afterlife for their sacrifice. Valith's rage was cold and terrible to behold as she issued orders for Dexter's immediate arrest. Danny survived the attack, though the medical team that worked on him said it was a miracle that he had lived long enough to reach them. His wounds were severe enough to kill most Zervani. And yet this fragile human had not only survived but had managed to protect the princess and kill two trained assassins while dying. The recovery took weeks, during which Danny drifted in and out of consciousness, while the most advanced medical technology in the Empire worked to rebuild his damaged body. Princess Lythe visited him every day without exception, sitting beside his bed and talking to him even when he could not respond. She told him about the political upheaval his sacrifice had caused and how the entire Empire was talking about the human who had nearly died to save a Zorvani. Princess Thexer's trial became the most watched event in the Empire's recent history. The Admiral maintained that he had acted to protect the purity of their race, but his defense crumbled in the face of what Danny had done. A human, supposedly inferior and primitive, had willingly given his life to protect someone who was not even his own species. What did that say about human nature? The prosecutors asked, what did it say about Zorvani arrogance and the assumptions they had made about other raced? Thexer was found guilty of treason and executed before a crowd that had once cheered his speeches about racial purity. The purist movement collapsed without his leadership as supporters abandoned their positions and pretended they had never believed in such extreme ideas. High Empress Valith addressed her people and declared that the Zervani had much to learn from the humans. They had become so convinced of their own superiority that they had forgotten how to adapt and change and survive. Human Danny Cole had shown them what true courage looked like, and it had nothing to do with genetic purity or technological advancement. When Danny finally woke up fully conscious, he found all three princesses standing around his bed with expressions he could not read. Keyleth told him that he had earned her respect and that she would be honored to call him a friend. Myrith said that his contribution to their species would be studied for generations, and Lythe simply took his hand in two of hers and held it without saying anything at all, though the tears in her silver eyes spoke more clearly than words ever could.